Lara, what exactly are you doing?
Ascending.
Ah, Tomb Raider. Everybody knows Tomb Raider, right? The campy relic from the 90s? Lara Croft? A wealthy, questionably dressed archaeologist discovering relics from the past and shooting at endangered wildlife? It was pretty good. All things considered, the franchise was doing pretty well for itself back then. The games had crazy high sales, they were getting supermodels to promote them, they even had a movie starring Angelina Jolie. Yet in the early noughties, the series fell into a bit of a rough patch. Somebody at Core Design must have panicked a little after they read the definition of diminishing returns, leading to the rushed creation of Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness. Which,
Mademoiselle Carvier, I have just come from Werner's apartment.
And how is Werner?
I'm afraid Werner is dead.
Dead?
Can I get you anything?
So the series got rebooted. The task of creating Tomb Raider games was given to some new blood. Crystal Dynamics, a developer who still creates the games to this very day. And boy did they start out with a bang! Their first shot at revitalizing Lara's adventures, Tomb Raider Legend, was a commercial and critical success, leading to further games that formed what fans like to call the LAU trilogy: Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld. One of the more embarrassing things about me, which, if you know me, is saying a lot, is how much I adore Tomb Raider Legend. I've played through this game more times than I've fed my cat. I could play through all of its levels blindfolded. It's genuinely one of my favourite games ever. It was my life when I first played it in my early adolescence. I say this partly to make sure you know there's probably going to be a bit of bias here, but also to surprise you when I say I don't really like Tomb Raider Underworld. I know, right? It honestly astounds me that the sequel to one of my favourite games, developed by the same team, managed to completely drop the ball, even with what sounds like a whole host of great ideas. And that's what I'd like to explore today. It's time for a deep dive into Tomb Raider Legend and Tomb Raider Underworld, to find out where the latter went so very wrong. Now, one of the things you find out quite quickly when you're trying to talk about a Tomb Raider game is how much you wind up talking about Lara Croft, considering it's mostly her name that carries the franchise clout. Everybody's heard of her, she's got a street named after her. I reckon I could show my gran this picture and she would recognise it as Lara Croft. To get into her character though and how it's portrayed in these games, we first have to look at their respective in-game stories. But here's the thing. When you break it down, both of these games have basically the same story. Lara is looking for her mother and goes on a world-hopping adventure to get all the pieces of a shiny weapon with a name nerds will recognise to help her in doing so. In Legend, you're chasing after Excalibur, and in Underworld, you're chasing after Mjolnir. Not complicated stories, but they're enough set up to create context for lots of different levels. Let's run through the stories one at a time, shall we? In Legend, the game starts with a short cold open to set up the relationship with Lara and her mother, ending with a plane crash before jumping to the present day in media res. Lara's in Bolivia, looking for an ancient artifact.
What sort of artifacts?
An ornate stone dais, among other things.
A big rock.
The first level of this game sets up the story really nicely. By only showing us a snippet of a plane crash and opening mid-exhibition, we get to spend most of the level focusing on getting to know the main team of characters, while musing on what may have happened to the plane. At the end of the level, Lara meets Rutland, a classic satin shirt wearing Tomb Raider style antagonist, wielding an artifact that triggers the memory of what happened after the plane crash. Essentially, we learn that as a child, Lara accidentally interfered with an ancient shrine, triggering a ritual that Lara's mother had to intervene in to rescue her. Lara's mum disappears, her condition and whereabouts unknown. We learn that this event led indirectly to her father's obsession and subsequent death, and more directly to Lara's desire to research ancient artifacts to find out what happened to her mother. This flashback also sets up Lara's character flaw. She acts recklessly, irrationally, and impulsively in regard to ancient artifacts without any consideration for their culture or the inherent danger that may arise with stealing relics that aren't meant for her. It's perfect for a character in a game like this, when you think about it. Having a character chase obsessively after these artifacts with little regard for her own safety means that we have context for why we're playing through comically dangerous levels. It means we can have Lara doing daredevil motorcycle stunts. It means we can have Lara going into dangerous underground tombs with sea serpents. and it means we can have Lara do the vehicle hanging over a precipice in a snowy area set piece way before Uncharted did it. You can infer a great amount of strength from Lara as a character because she knows she's going to be putting herself in danger, and as such has prepared herself both mentally with the help of some supporting characters, and physically with all her gymnastic ability and firearms. It shows that she's wise to her faults, but has found a way to use her power and wealth to suppress them. A coping mechanism that may have worked thus far, but can be challenged by the events of this game. Sorry, I'm getting off track already. Speaking of the events of this game, Rutland lets on that a figure from Lara's past is who led him to the relic Lara is after, and taunts her to go looking for answers where she last saw them. Lara goes to Peru, and we're introduced to this figure, Amanda. There's a flashback where they're part of a mining operation that unearths a demon creature who kills everybody bar these two. You actually get to play through this part where you're chased by the demon. It's quite a cool perspective shift. Amanda winds up trapped in a flooding cave, and Lara's forced to leave her behind. Back in the present day, Lara travels down the now abandoned and flooded mineshaft and discovers not only that Amanda's body is missing, but also that there's a ceremonial replica of the mythical sword Excalibur. We learn from this replica that the genuine sword has been split into many pieces, one of which, as we saw earlier, Rutland and Amanda already possess. Having found out seemingly what Rutland and Amanda are after, Lara begins to start pursuing them. There's a couple more levels set in Japan and Ghana collecting pieces of the sword from Rutland, as well as a character from Lara's past, Takamoto. I love how they introduce Takamoto as well. They only allude to their history together, but they imply that him and Lara have butted heads in the past in a way that really damaged Takamoto's pride.
I don't know. Let's see. Try begging for your life like you did the last time we spoke.
It's quite cool. Once Lara has both of their sword fragments, we find out that Amanda has raided Croft Manor off-screen. Lara chases her to the next level, where we find out she was saved from drowning as a young woman by bonding with the demon that killed their friends. She keeps it in check using a purple Chaos Emerald it's tethered to. Amanda's got a little twist on the classic villain motivation of being angry at the protagonist just because they didn't manage to save them.
I'm sorry, Amanda. If I'd known that you were alive, I swear I would have done everything I could to save you.
Please. I got over that a long time ago. You know what really used to bug me, though? When I got out and saw that you left without even trying to... What is it archaeologists do? Oh, right. Dig.
It's not particularly deep, but, it's cool to have a Shadow the Hedgehog type character to act as a dark mirror of Lara. She does have another motivation for what she's doing, but it's not revealed just yet. Lara takes another piece of the sword out from under Amanda's nose, and from there on there's a couple more levels based around putting together Excalibur set in England and Nepal. The part where it comes together is really cool as well. Lara has to go back to the shrine where she lost her mother, as it turns out she had the final piece all along. Once you've forged Excalibur, you have to use it to break out. You get to experience Lara's reaction to finally finding what her father was looking for.
If my father had known any of this, he tried so hard, and they hated him for it.
No one hated him, Lara.
It bloody well wasn't love, was it? His reputation was destroyed. Now there's more than one thing to be salvaged from that mountaintop.
There's anger, elation, and vindication in the validation. It's really cool to see her take a moment for herself, returning to the site of one of the defining moments of her life as well. It's great stuff. And then the ending, which is absolutely insane. Lara returns to the shrine from the start of the game, set in the dead of night, contrasting with the bright day from before. She fights back all the mercenaries using Excalibur, until it's just her and Amanda, who tries to stop her from using the stone. Realizing that they can't settle their differences through discussion, they get ready to battle it out. The final boss of this game features you kung fu flipping around the dais using Excalibur to shoot lasers at a goth girl's demon stand. That is the most video game sentence I've ever spoken, and yet it needs speaking to convey how mental this final boss is. With Amanda defeated, Lara activates the dais, and what does she hear? Her mother. The same dialogue from the very beginning of the game. Amanda warns Lara that she needs to remove the sword, otherwise she'll cause an explosion which will kill them both. Lara begins to call out, desperately trying to convince her mother not to touch the sword. Watching the scene unfold, A pit forms in your stomach as you remember back to the original events, where Lara's mum could only hear a muffled voice. Lara's mother mishears her and pulls out the sword, teleporting her away and damning history to remain the same. Lara loses her mother, and her impulsive behaviour regarding answers about her mother's past and the ancient artifacts related to it have now begun to hurt and affect other people. Lara failed to listen to Amanda's warning, failed to overcome her character flaw, and as such, is once again left a scared girl on her own in the world. The narrative excellently comes full circle. In a state of fury, Lara interrogates Amanda, who explains that pulling out the sword would have sent the wielder to Avalon, and by not listening to her, she's damned her mother to be sent there all those years ago. Exactly the thing that really pushes the buttons of the distraught Lara. So yeah, Amanda wanting to go to Avalon was her motivation, which is a bit weird, but you hardly notice because honestly, the drama here is just really insane. There's a reason why anybody who plays this game remembers these lines, why if you want to buy any fan-made Legend memorabilia, it always features this quote.
From this moment, your every breath is a gift from me.
Damn. Lara composes herself. Although she failed at saving her mother this time, she's been given a glimmer of hope. Her mother may still be alive, dwelling in Avalon. Lara readies her team and leaves the battlefield with a newfound goal and a newfound drive to save her mother.
Tell him my father was right about everything, and there may still be time to do something about it.
Oh man, I love this story. It's so refreshing to see a video game where the player character actually fails to overcome their flaws and is forced to learn their lessons the hard way. That's almost the perfect way to start a duology. Have a character fail to accomplish their goals in the first game so that they can grow and show that they've really developed in the subsequent sequel. The story has a perfect amount of cheeky action heroine fun, but it also knows when to bring in the spotlights to get deathly serious, really ascribing an actual personality to one of gaming's oldest heroines. Unfortunately, you have to be in the mindset of assuming they're going to follow through on everything they've set up in this game in the sequel to really appreciate the story as a whole. And Underworld's story, well, Underworld takes the story in a bit of a strange direction. The game starts with a cold open tutorial level which sets up a fair amount of intrigue. It teaches you the mechanics of the game in a short opening platforming section where Lara's house is burning down, and it ends with a cutscene where this character, Zip, claims that Lara started the fire and tries to shoot her. Not a bad setup. The perspective then shifts back to shortly after the end of Legend, with Lara looking for a clue as to the whereabouts of Avalon. At the end of the first level, which takes place in the Mediterranean Sea, Lara finds one of Thor's gauntlets which binds itself to the shape of her hand. Unfortunately, she's then ambushed by mercenaries working for Amanda who take the gauntlet away. Lara escapes the undersea temple and gives chase to Amanda's ship. After fighting her way below deck, Lara finds Amanda taking instructions from an unseen character. Once Amanda leaves, Lara turns the corner revealing... okay. So this is Natla, an evil goddess with bat wings who also happens to be the main villain of the very first Tomb Raider game. In between the release of Tomb Raider Legend and Underworld, there had been a remake of the first Tomb Raider game released for the brand's 10th anniversary, fittingly titled Tomb Raider Anniversary, and I guess this was their way of tying into that game. I mean, at the end of Anniversary, Natla did get a bit squished, so she's looking remarkably good all things considered. I think they did establish she was immortal, so it's not too implausible that she's back here. It's about to become very apparent that they want to set Natla up as being the author of all Lara's pain. They start doing this by mentioning here that Natla was influencing Amanda this whole time, having taken her under her wing, pun not intended. Natla's in a sharing mood, so she tells Lara she needs to get some more pieces of ancient Norse clothing so that she can wield Thor's hammer and open the way to Avalon. Lara escapes whilst getting her gauntlet back, and heads to the next level, where she gets the location of the next gauntlet, without much in the way of plot happening. Lara returns to Croft Manor, and after a short trip underground, she finds the second gauntlet. Returning upstairs, there's a sudden explosion, and we're back in the area the cold open was set in. As Zip tries to shoot Lara this time, she talks him down and goes to check her home security. Lara Croft has an evil clone. That's right, we've got another literal Shadow the Hedgehog character. Not that it really matters at all. There's a level where Lara gets Thor's belt, and then a subsequent level where you pick up Mjolnir itself. Not a whole bunch of plot happens during these. Once you've got Mjolnir, you return to another seemingly identical ship that Amanda just has, apparently, and fight your way through to reach Natla again. Natla reveals to Lara that they're going to have to get to Avalon together. She's got a magic spell and Lara has the hammer, and they're calling it Helheim now. Are you still following? Amanda shows up, says her first line to Lara in the game before getting immediately thrown in the bin. Natla is broken out and escapes, and I guess we're getting to the climax now. Okay. Everybody meets up together in Helheim, and shit starts to hit the fan. So, Lara's mum turned into a zombie, and Lara has to kill her, rationalising that her mum is long gone. Natla reveals that it was her who killed Lara's father, again, revealing that she's the author of all Lara's pain. Amanda turns out to have survived that. And she teams up with Lara to kill the evil clone and hold off an army of thralls, setting aside their differences for a temporary alliance. The game doesn't have a final boss per se, but more of a final puzzle. You have to climb around this thing while Natla flies about and inconveniences you a fair bit. I'm not quite sure what we're trying to stop here, but given the fact that Natla has never really had any motivations other than rule the world, we'll just assume it's a world-ruling machine. Amanda arrives just in time to lay the final blow against Natla, and Lara causes the chamber they're in to start collapsing. As it turns out though, the shrine Lara's mother was teleported to is close by, and they're able to use it to teleport back to the area in Nepal from Tomb Raider Legend. The two agree not to kill each other, as regular people do, and leave on shaky terms. It's a fairly hollow victory, if one could even consider it a victory at all. It left me with a really odd feeling, but I realise that this reflects the game's story overall when you think about it. The story of Underworld just seems really confused. The tight rivalry between Lara and Amanda is kind of thrown aside in favour of introducing two new villains, one of whom is one-dimensional and dull, and the other who literally says nothing and unceremoniously dies seemingly for no reason. They just add bloat, if anything. If it were up to me, I would have really developed Amanda a bit more, to really squeeze some drama out of these two former friends. Enough about Amanda was left unknown by the end of Legend that she could have had lots of development in this game. Either having her slowly get redeemed through more moral actions, or have her, go beyond redemption in dogged pursuit of Avalon, a real dark mirror to Lara, acting as a contrast to show how far she's come over the course of her journey. I mean, what do we get by bringing Natla back? We get maybe half a second of, oh, that's cool, I guess, I recognise her, from those who've played a version of the first game, but that's all. Otherwise, all she does is suck up time for development from Amanda. In fact, Amanda's character is actively worsened by this story. She's basically robbed of all agency when we learn she's been manipulated by Natla this whole time. One could make the argument that this makes Amanda more sympathetic, but one can shut down that argument when you see how little screen time she gets in favour of Natla and the evil clone. And speaking of the evil clone, or the doppelganger, what was she for? She shows up halfway through the game, kicks about doing what Natla tells her, and then it's just unceremoniously killed. There's no boss fight or anything. It's like, what's the point in introducing this all-new character and hastily explaining why she exists if you're barely going to do anything with her? As far as I'm aware, she just exists for the weak-as-fuck cold-open cliffhanger. The fact that she's a copy of Lara never comes up again after the Croft Manor midpoint. The only thing I can think of is maybe they were trying to have their cake and eat it too, having Amanda be redeemed as well as having a quite literal dark parallel to Lara to show her development. There's really nothing here to back up that idea though. The doppelganger doesn't act like Lara, she doesn't act like anyone else either. She has no character at all, there's nothing here. In my eyes, if they were desperate to bring back Natla, I see no reason why Amanda couldn't have just taken the place of the doppelganger. But even that doesn't solve the problem of Natla basically being here for no reason. Things happening for no reason really does seem to be the overall problem with this plot as a whole. Lara functionally performs all the tasks she needs to for the plot, but there's really nothing in the way of growth. Lara ends the game in basically the same position that she started. She knows the truth about her mother, but otherwise she hasn't changed. This game doesn't ascribe Lara any character traits, so we have to go off the ones given to her in Legend. And even then, there's no exploration of her character flaws. Lara acts rashly and impulsively, but there's no direct consequences for her actions as there were in Legend, so there's no indication at all as to whether or not her character is growing or changing or developing at all. Honestly, it feels silly to even try digging for any deeper meaning, because this game has so little in the way of story. It was really upsetting to me to go from the really enjoyable swashbuckling adventure story with some great characters that I had enjoyed in Legend to what feels like a complete regression in its sequel. It was like taking a long warm shower and having the water run out halfway through. And much like in that scenario, I was left feeling pretty cold by the end. And I need to go back to the point about Lara's characterization not being great in Underworld. It's not that she just does nothing in the story, it's also how she's shown in the game on a moment-to-moment basis. The Lara Croft that we see in Tomb Raider Underworld is a lot less engaging than the one in Tomb Raider Legend, and for the most part, that's because it's really hard to get a feel for Underworld Lara's characterization at all. All of the cutscenes portray Lara simply explaining why she's about to go and desecrate some tombs, or why what she's found in said desecrated tombs is interesting. Which is fine as setup, I suppose. It is a game about collecting magic MacGuffins, so it does do the bare minimum of contextualizing them, but I just don't find it all that interesting. Contrast this with Legend Lara, and it's night and day. Legend Lara reacts to the interesting things she finds.
Will you look at that? Oh, this is brilliant.
There's a whole cutscene dedicated to finding a shoe that could have belonged to a young Amanda when Lara returns to Peru, and the delivery of this line...
It's been unlaced. I never imagined she could have survived.
...has stuck with me to this day. Elsewhere, she's cheekily bantering with Soviet soldiers, expressing genuine concern for her friends, and I've already shown you the outburst after the final boss, which had me a little frightened when I was younger. It lent itself well to exploring her main character flaw I mentioned, her impulsiveness. Lara gleefully makes a lot of reckless decisions throughout this game,
Nishimura's gonna bill you for that.
and we get to hear her friends accosting her as she justifies her actions.
Lara, this is crazy people stuff. Don't ever do that again.
Some may say a lot of Lara's characterization is kinda generic action girl stuff, which, yeah, there is a lot of.
Now this is better.
But I find it's an awful lot more engaging to watch than Lara seemingly not being fazed by anything at all. There's a cutscene early on in Underworld where she finds one of Thor's gauntlets, and yeah, there's a little shocked face when this scarab thing grafts itself to her hand with energy racing everywhere, but then it's just back to filming her caving vlog like this is Tuesday to her. Honestly, Lara doesn't have much in the way of a reaction to anything, even shooting her own mother. Did you forget? It's only the driving motivation for Lara in these two games, and I only dedicated one line in my script to how it's resolved, because it sure feels like the game does the same thing. Granted, it's not like there's many opportunities to characterize Lara now that they've massively downplayed the presence of the supporting cast. In Legend, Lara had a communicator, this Xbox headset looking thing. Due to this, Lara is in fairly frequent comms with the characters of Zip and Alistair, and in my eyes, these characters are great. Zip is like a tech dude, but he's also laid back and cool, and more than willing to diffuse more harrowing moments with little quips.
Wow. You know you're gonna ruin your boots.
While also having really sweet moments where he expresses concern for, and even comforts Lara.
Man, that's a wreck. How old were you? 8 or 9?
Something like that.
Alistair, on the other hand, is almost the complete opposite. Bookish, nervous, and skeptical of most of the things Lara winds up finding in her travels. Because of this, he often disagrees with Zip, and it's great to watch his cynicism clash with Zip and Lara's more open-minded takes.
So the shaman would be Merlin, and the staff would be whatever the hell King Arthur's sword was called. It's called coincidence.
These two communicate with Lara throughout the game, and the rapport is really strong. The characters discuss theories as to what the villains are planning, or how historical events may have occurred.
Remind you of something?
The King Arthur myth. Yes, the similarities are striking.
King Arthur? A little help here?
They comment on the various items Lara finds, or some of her more gleeful, cheeky antics.
It was nice, but it was in the way.
Sometimes they even chime in to offer hints to some of the puzzles.
How am I supposed to move it if I can't touch it?
The cable on your grapple is insulated.
Right.
And best of all, Lara joins in. Lara will gleefully tease Zip or accost Alistair for his bad takes.
The real Merlin would roll around in the mud and bark at you, and I'm being generous by calling it mud.
There's no difference between stupid and charming with you, is there?
The bickering between the three really creates the idea that you're a team of friends all working together to solve a real mystery. There's even points in the game where the villains hack your communications, and it's great to see Lara and the gang get taken aback by this, even their one-liners suffering a bit.
You were always such the scientist. You're probably right at home with all these Tesla contraptions, aren't you?
As much as anyone, I suppose.
All of this makes some of the sections where you'd be doing what would otherwise be somewhat benign puzzle platforming warm and inviting. You're never bored, and the characters are keeping you up to date on the story and events going on. The communicator is one of my favourite parts about this game, and I'd like to think people at the time agreed. After all, Tomb Raider's main contemporary, Uncharted, started in between the release of Legend and Underworld, and it definitely understood the vitality of having its characters interact with each other. However, I guess I was wrong about liking it, and I can't have nice things because Underworld does not care about Zip and Alistair. You see them for brief moments at the start of some of the levels, granted. I was so happy starting this game for the first time to see Lara casually Skyping them with their fun dynamic in full swing.
Hey, Lara. Find it yet?
Patience, Zip. I warned you that conveniently undiscovered islands would be scarce in the Mediterranean.
Are you sure this Eddington chap knows what he's talking about?
But then the level starts, and it's just silence. There's no communication in the levels at all. However, the game still needs to explain all the interesting MacGuffins it's putting in front of you. So occasionally the levels just grind to a halt for some cutscenes where Lara gets out a camera and starts vlogging about whatever she's seeing in a disinterested monotone. You just get one perspective on what's happening in the story, and the game has to grind to a halt to tell you it. I was hoping for at least a little more of Zip and Alistair before the following couple of levels, but you only get 2 more short cutscenes before Alistair is just unceremoniously killed off by Lara's evil clone. And then Zip articulates my thoughts perfectly.
What? Alistair's dead, and it's just business as usual?
And Lara basically says, yeah, kinda. I can believe Lara Croft is impulsive enough to want to keep continuing on despite the death of her friend, it being her main character flaw in this series, but there's not even a second of mourning for the dude. Legend Lara would have been angry and gone off blindly on impulse after the clone, but in Underworld, Lara basically ignores her dead friend and starts calculating her next move while I'm sat crying in the corner over the symbolic loss of one of my favourite features from the last game. In fairness, it does get a little better toward the end of the game, but hey, what do you know, that's the part where more characters from the previous game show up and Lara's able to interact with them. It's also kind of expected, considering this is where we should be wrapping up all the arcs of this supposed trilogy, so I'm not giving out too many points there. I think it's unfortunate, particularly as whilst I was doing research for this game, I found an interview with the developers where they said it was a conscious decision to remove the comlink to give players more of a sense of isolation.
One of the biggest things that I got out of it early on was the complaints about how much Alistair and Zip were ruining the moment, which was something that I actually was personally responsible for in Legend because I was the story designer, and we were playing with how much we wanted to hear Lara's voice and her interacting, so we kind of went overboard on it, and we liked what we had, but I definitely missed that sense of isolation. Explorer on the top of the world, you're the first one there, you're all on your own.
And I could respect that if they really wanted me to dwell on the mysteries of the story myself. Unfortunately, the mystery in this game isn't really teased enough. Whether or not Lara's mum still being alive is really the only thread the game has to dangle over you, and honestly this only really exists if you've played Legend. When there is a genuine mystery in the form of the doppelganger, it's just hand-waved away, and I'm sat there like, no! No! If you're gonna leave me alone in these caves climbing featureless walls and exploring barren landscapes, I want to be occupying my mind with something! At least let me wonder if Lara once donated her blood to the Umbrella Corporation or something. You have to give me something here! Tomb Raider Underworld isn't Metroid. It's hard to imagine a character as warm and fearless as Lara Croft wanting no contact, when contact with people is seemingly her main goal. Now that we've talked about Lara's character traits, I'd like to talk a little about how her design changes from game to game. Because in my eyes, Underworld fails to develop Lara to be in any way more progressive. I've always argued that Lara Croft is a character whose fame has taken away a large amount of her agency, and what I mean by that is that everybody sees the character in the adverts for the games, which are obviously very male-gazy to appeal to the only demographic that the game industry thinks exists, that being horny teenage boys, let's not beat around the bush. Due to the fact that games are so insular and exclusive as a medium, a casual observer will have no context about Tomb Raider beyond these rather thirsty adverts. Indeed, I talked earlier about how the name Lara Croft holds more value than the name Tomb Raider.
Hugh, do you play Tomb Raider at all? No, but I like the girl in it.
Basically, she's a character who has never really been given a chance to develop, which has never really helped in the debate of how much of an overlap there is in the Venn diagram of feminist and empowering versus sexist and objectifying. I'm obviously not the person to ask if you want an opinion on Lara from the perspective of a woman, but I've heard various multiple opinions falling on both sides of the argument from friends of mine who have enjoyed the games. So yeah, that's going to fall to individual opinion. It may be irrelevant, but I know from my point of view as a child, I saw Legend Lara as a bit of a role model to me.
Really, Zip? It's like going up a set of stairs, only far less boring.
Yeah.
She was among my favourite characters. I still say that I started getting fitter because I wanted to be able to pull myself up from ledges and do cool aerobic stuff, and characters like Lara, as well as other characters like Faith from Mirror's Edge, they were my inspirations. I spent a long time in a summer camp trying to do this flippy shit. My point here is that the Lara that's portrayed in Underworld doesn't have much in the way of characterization beyond liking cool treasure and not liking evil Batwomen, so her character is rendered more two-dimensional. This just leaves you with her visual design, which, for some of the outfits in this game, is just ridiculous. Like, this wetsuit really irritates me. It seems like the artists were really proud of this costume. It shows up literally in the first level, it was all over the marketing, they even made an actual real-life version for an actual real-life model to wear. Honestly, this cutscene started, and as soon as the camera panned below waist height, I had questions. Why is it designed to ride up her bum like it does? I suppose it could be less restrictive on her legs while she's swimming, but there are other ways to do that involve some fucking shoes! I'm watching Lara jump and climb around this rough, rocky undersea tomb with bare legs and feet! Have you ever run on a rocky beach in bare feet? That shit really hurts. I can't help but wince when I watch Lara shimmying up these rocky spires, and then we get to parts where she slides down them and it's just... ow! So... clearly it's not practical. It is just seemingly so the gamer's TM can stare at her bum whilst playing without seemingly wondering how this would affect an actual human woman. There's a slightly more sensible wetsuit that you can pick later that I was desperate for, considering that level takes place in the Arctic Sea. But the game still isn't getting props, as the original is still given to you as an option. If you look in the concept art, there are loads of way better designs, some that even include the blessed shoes. Having done some research, they look far more like actual wetsuits as well. What the fuck? Wetsuit aside, Lara's main costume between the games is basically the same. Both games have different costumes for when it gets colder, but they're all still very male-gazy. Look at the artwork used to promote the game. It's like, get your head out of the gutter. Even the box art of Underworld, the piece of art that is supposed to sum up and communicate exactly what the game is about, is just a zoomed in shot of Lara's midriff. This isn't selling that we're going to be able to play as Lara Croft, this is selling that we're going to be staring at Lara's body. And I'm not saying that Legend's designs were much better, mind you, but at least I can see those making more practical sense. The Japan level features a very extravagant backless party dress that Lara rips the sides off and proceeds to adventure through the rest of the level in. I remember my parents walking in at this part. I got a very stern talking to. It's obviously very overtly designed for those who like girls to have a little ogle at, but at the very least in this scenario, it makes a bit of sense. It comes at a point in the story when Lara is trying to attract attention from Takamoto so she can steal one of the pieces of Excalibur from him. Although, mind you, she Probably could have taken a moment to grab some more fitting clothes from the party host once the gunfighting's died down. Be like, hey, have you got a tracksuit I can borrow? Anyway, Lara not only has far stronger characterization in Legend, but her costume choices make a little more sense as well. And I find this a far more engaging and relatable portrayal. And at least one who only went barefoot when she was in a high-rise penthouse and not, you know. And you know, I'm not dumb. Well, not that dumb. I can see it's a contrived chain of events to get Lara wearing basically rags for her level. But at least there's a little bit of justification as to why she's dressed the way she is. And thinking about it, given the devil-may-care Lara that this game is set up, I can see her having no problem with this costume at all, which I guess would make it kind of a progressive thing? Underworld immediately drops the ball as soon as you start the game up with some frankly horrible UI. I don't know if they were trying to put a contemporary spin on the classic Tomb Raider ring of levitating objects design from the original games, but what you're left with is this half circle of random graphics that you have to cycle round to by pointing the analog stick. If you let go of a direction, it automatically selects the symbol in the middle, which continues from your last save. This means if you want to read about what one of the icons represents, you have to keep the direction held down. When you click on an option, you'll either be taken to a more sensible menu where you can finally do what you wanted to, or it will just reveal more stupid icons on the other side of the wheel. I actually hate this design so much. Looking at the menu from Legend and even Anniversary, I mean, yeah, it's a little dry, but it's clear, consistent, and it even changes to show Lara chilling out in the different environments from the game depending on where you last saved. It's so much easier to understand. That, and if you've just started the game up, it also comes after this cheesy Bond-style opening that's really charming, so you won't be in a bad mood. Another issue with Underworld's design is that they've really irritatingly taken out the ability to play through a level again without the arduous process of restarting the game in treasure hunt mode and selecting a location from your PDA. And even then you can't watch the cutscenes again. This is only available once you've done a full playthrough. This means I can't do the thing that I love to do with Legend, where I could just start the game up and be blasting my way through the Kazakhstan level in less than a minute. I probably wasn't going to be doing that all too much given my opinions on this game and its longer levels, but I think having the option to play a level again devoid of a save state would be a really good feature, and it's a shame the opportunity is passed up here. Now unfortunately neither of these games have particularly unique soundtracks. For the most part it's basic faux movie orchestra stuff. Basically just kind of mood music for cave exploring. That being said, Underworld still has it worse than Legend. Hear me out. I only say this because whereas Legend has music that is at best memorable and at worst just background noise, Underworld has music that is at best forgettable and at worst completely kills the mood. And I really want to drill in on that killing the mood. Remember earlier when I said that they cut out the communication to impose isolation? Well, in some levels like the Halls of Valhalla, when you're just trying to move blocks around to climb ledges, the music is like go, go, go! Including these horrible, discordant thrall noises. It sounds like music you'd hear in a Michael Bay adaptation of Silent Hill, and it really doesn't fit the mood at all. Otherwise, it's mostly just droning, echoey, ambient sounds which serve their purpose, but aren't particularly memorable, and never really set all that much of a mood. Now obviously nostalgia plays a role in me declaring the Legend soundtrack better. I can recognise that a lot of tracks in Legend have the same problems as Underworld. A fair amount of them are kind of forgettable ambient sounds, but some of the themes really stick out. Take the Bolivia level for example. As you start the level it hits you with this gentle choir and subtle harp strings to complement the fact that you're ascending heavenward, and also to instill a sense of wonder at the majesty of the mountain and our shiny new 2006 graphics. Then as you move on and take out your first enemy, the music ramps up, it gets a bit more playful. And then the vibe changes from pleasure to business with the reveal that some mercenaries are after the same thing Lara is, and shit is about to start flying fanward. There's 7 more variations of this theme in the first level alone. including a part where they fade out some of the more light-hearted elements of the music as you do some puzzling and platforming, and of course there's a variation at the end of the level that brings in motifs from the game's main theme to really drive home the fact that this is one of the inciting incidents of our story. We should probably talk about the main themes as well. Legend's theme plays over the main menu, and it really mirrors how the player may be feeling as they start the game. The soothing woodwind as you get your bearings complementing a model of Lara gearing up for adventure, before eventually kicking in with this choral melody as you get closer to playing that really pumps you up for your tomb raiding adventures. Underworld actually incorporates some of Legend's motifs later on, but it's mostly just kind of a gently uplifting call and response. It's basically the same melody all the way through, but with more instruments added onto it so it gets more exciting. The problem to me is that this theme sounds far too uplifting considering everything else about the game is telling us we're dark and realistic now. It feels like it should have sounded a bit more ominous to complement these ideas. Underworld's theme literally plays over a house in the rain as well. There's nothing that can get you hyped up about that. Honestly, just listening to these two soundtracks while writing this script up, every track in Underworld has such little personality, whereas in Legend there's far more diversity. The muted piano of Croft Manor that provides excellent ambience to exploring a huge estate house. The surprisingly soothing vocals in the high-speed desert motorbike sequence. The funky beats while you blast your way through Takamoto's penthouse. Or the harsh noughties techno in the Kazakhstan train chase. There's even a little bit of hard rock in the Nepal level. Really, there's no contest here at all. Sound design wise, there's honestly not too much to say about either game. Both of them have cool secret revealing noises when you find a collectible, and they're nice nods back to the original games. Other than that, the sound design in both games is fairly naturalistic, if a little garish. Sometimes there's some loud gunshot noises, and unfortunately there's not a lot of sound options in the menu. Really, I just wanted to include this section to complain about these hammers in Underworld. They sound like elephants being choked to death, and they're just constant. This paired up with the constant buggy platforming in this level honestly had me the closest to just saying fuck it and giving up on playing this game to the end. Hammer sound bad, shit game, 0 out of 10. So speaking of levels, Tomb Raider Underworld is somewhat lacking in variety when it comes to playable levels. The game claims to feature 8 distinct stages, which on paper is the same as Legend. However, you look a little closer and you realise that one of these levels is just the opening prologue, and that's just a slice of gameplay from later in the story that's about a minute long. You notice that another one of the levels is just a shootout with some enemies in an environment that you've already seen in an earlier level. That's 2 levels that are shorter than 5 minutes and do nothing but reuse environments. So in my eyes, we're disqualifying them. You may argue, but Alex, the game still has 6 more conventional unique levels, and on average they're longer than the levels in Legend, so the game isn't lacking for unique visually interesting content. And yeah, okay, in theory the player isn't losing out on playtime, and 6 new unique areas isn't a bad number, particularly now this game is being made with shiny 7th generation graphics. However, I would argue in practice the level aesthetics are kinda samey. Like, if we look at our level list again, you'll notice that 2 of these areas are literally just the sea. Both start with very similar goofy swimming around an open area that's far too big to find whatever key you need to open up a door to lead you to a temple. 2 of these levels are just open jungle environments, and 2 of them are musty, dreary caves, including the Croft Manor level, which we'll come back to later. There are slight variations on these motifs, but to me the game really only has 3 level themes, so it's not very visually diverse. Combined with the fact that the levels are longer and drawn out, the lack of different themes in levels really starts to make the game seem dull. Contrast this with Legend and whoa, look at this! You've got dusty mountains, bougie penthouses, dilapidated theme parks, and military bases. There's so much aesthetic variety and levels are constantly changing. For instance, the Peru level starts with a shootout in a desert town, continues into a cool motorbike chase, follows on to a flashback with demons and a tense horror tone, and then continues to have a flooded temple that you need to drain, explore, and then shoot your way out of. So much happens in every single level of Legend. It's exhilarating. It really helps to create the sense of a globe-trotting adventure full of exciting locations. Even when we get to the titular tombs, they're visually distinct. We've got snowy tombs, copyright-infringing tombs, even actual mass tombs with actual coffins. You look at Underworld and it's just generic glowy blue tomb where you push things. Generic glowy blue tomb where you push things. Generic glowy... These are all different levels! The structure of Underworld levels is quite different to the structure of Legend levels. Underworld stages feature a lot of wide open areas to explore, but really the part of the level you actually need to visit and interact with is only a small part of them. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. You could put some little mini puzzles out in these wide open areas for some collectibles maybe. Perhaps other interesting flavor text or set dressing. You're smart enough to have picked up on my tone by now, no doubt, so you'll know there's neither of these things. No, instead the collectibles are just kind of lying about or in these little clusters of pots. No challenge involved in getting them, they're just there. It means if you'd like to play the game thoroughly, you'll need to comb over a whole bunch of otherwise empty level with only 1 or 2 scripted encounters with random enemies to break up the busy work. Did I say only if you're planning on being thorough? Because I lied. You actually need to comb over these areas anyway, because sometimes there will be items you need for the way ahead also just lying about somewhere in these levels. It means that a fair amount of your time in this game may just be spent swimming around a cavernous space looking for the one valve you need, or hopping about a jungle looking for a stick to make a ledge with. It means the substantial levels in Underworld feel padded and bloated. In one case you have the Mexico level where the game drops you in an open map with 4 separate little puzzle rooms to do, with just long enough of a commute between each one that it feels irritating. You could make the argument, Alex, that's good open-ended level design, but these puzzles have to be completed in a certain order that the game just doesn't tell you. Therefore, it's possible you can spend a huge amount of the first part of this level driving back and forth between these different puzzles with nothing else to occupy your mind. I'm not against the idea of more open Tomb Raider levels, but I think they miss the mark here. Legends levels are far more linear, which I know was in the early stages of becoming a dirty word in the gaming industry by that point in time, but it leads to levels that are far better paced and can allow for some of the variety that I mentioned earlier. I'm not saying that the open-ended levels are bad ideas, but in my eyes, linearity is just a lot more preferable. In fact, you want to talk open levels? Let's talk about the Croft Manor level in Tomb Raider Legend. It's a returning mode from the old Tomb Raider games that wasn't necessary for the story. You could completely ignore it if you want. It's a bonus area that works as a way to help humanize Lara a bit more using environmental storytelling as you explore her fancy house and see a lot of little humanizing touches. Her casually discarded boots, a little circle of post-it notes, a wardrobe in disarray. Yet it works as a fun open-ended level in its own right. Everywhere you look in the house there are secret passages and fun little platforming challenges to help you find collectibles. It's a fun little bonus level, bumping the total levels in the game up to 9. It really demonstrates just how much heart was being placed into the game. To see this level reduced to a tiny basement light puzzle and a 1-minute tutorial platforming section in Underworld is really very sad to me. One would think that with the focus being more on open-ended areas in Underworld, a full-blown Croft Manor would be a shoo-in. But again, I guess I can't have nice things. I realise I've been talking a fair amount about these two games without actually mentioning the gameplay part. We should probably do that. Well, gameplay-wise, these two games are fairly similar. Both of them are essentially cinematic platformers with lots of clearly defined ledge-based platforming. Think the 3D Prince of Persia games. The game loop changes between platforming and combat depending on the scenario, but the two don't tend to mix in Legend, only Underworld. Whilst exploring in Legend, the player can push and pull objects with or without the help of a magnetic grappling hook, and jump to ledges as well as vertical and horizontal poles. When you're holding a ledge or pole, you can jump from your position, drop down, or use a grappling hook to swing from any available grapple point. It's a very simple system that works really well. Paired with level design that makes it easy to decipher where you can and can't jump to, and some fairly niftily designed puzzles, it makes for some really fun little levels to navigate through while listening to the banter with your supporting cast and looking for collectibles. All of this is communicated really well. Lara has a bunch of different animations to communicate which direction she'll jump when you hold a direction on the analog stick. Because of this, there's no ambiguity as to which direction she'll be travelling once you commit to the maneuver. There's even a fun little mechanic where if you jump at an awkward frame of Lara's animation, she'll grab the ledge in an awkward way, and you have to hit a button quickly to make sure she keeps hold. It's a good way to keep you on your toes so you don't get complacent during the climbing. Lara is also really sticky when it comes to ledges. When you jump ordinarily, it's very lacking, only really kicking into gear when jumping towards a section of the level that you can climb. Seeing this communicates to the player that these clearly defined climbing points are what you need to be aiming for, and consequently teaches you to scan the level design for said points. Lara's grabbing animations can look a little floaty sometimes, but due to her stickiness, when they connect with the climbing points, it's really snappy and satisfying. The game establishes early on that the grappling hook is magnetic, and therefore only connects to metal items in the environment. Therefore, when you enter a room and see a metal cage, a golden dragon statue, or really anything that's remotely shiny, you know that you can influence it with the grappling hook.
So what kind of ancient artifact you got there?
The modern kind.
The defined ledges and clear establishing of what can and can't be influenced by Lara really conditions the player to scout the levels ahead for solutions to puzzles or routes through platforming sections, and makes them feel clever by solving them. Even though the game is technically spoon-feeding you the answers, it's such a satisfying experience to play. Now, Underworld had a big emphasis on expanding Lara's moveset. The dev diaries at the time repeatedly bring up a design philosophy of, what could Lara do? This initiative involved including a bunch of extra moves for exploration that were treated as new, despite being introduced in Anniversary a year before. You can perch on top of poles and jump between them now, which is fun. You can also stand on thick ledges and horizontal poles now, allowing for platforming to take place in tighter spaces. They've included the ability to rappel up and down walls with the grappling hook now, which is nice. They've also added some moves exclusive to Underworld, like the ability to jump between certain walls that are close together to scale them, or the ability to climb these odd-looking handholds by holding one direction and doing nothing else! All of this is good stuff in theory, but unfortunately only the podium perching feels good to use. I mean, look at this. Wah wah. When using the grappling hook to rappel up or down something, it never feels as seamless as it should. Jumping backwards off a ledge doesn't descend you very far at all, and often Lara will just start doing the wall running animation. You have to wait for her to calm down before the game registers that you're holding the rappel button. The same when ascending. You have to get right up close to the wall before you're given the contextual button prompt, and then you have to wait for Lara to align herself in the proper way before the climbing can begin. It also doesn't help that the grappling hook likes to disconnect when you aren't pointing the camera the right way, so more than once I've just plummeted to my death when I wanted to be rappelling. The wall jumping unfortunately isn't great either. It only works between very specific walls that don't show up very often, which frequently led me to forgetting that I even had the move. It doesn't help that even when you can wall jump, it sometimes just doesn't work. Lara has definitely lost any stickiness she may have had in Legend. You can hammer away on the button, and sometimes Lara will just forget she's climbing a wall and will drop back down. This starts irksome when it happens early in the game, and gets infuriating when it starts happening over bottomless pits later on. It also doesn't help that the environments start including parts that look like they should be wall jumpable, and yet they aren't. That leads me to some of the issues with game feel in Underworld. As with most games on the 7th generation of game consoles, developers were putting more effort into making experiences seem more realistic.
Whoa, nice graphics!
One of the efforts designed to add realism was to have an actual gymnast do motion capture for all the moves done by Lara in the game. So now, whilst Lara is running around the levels, she'll push branches out of the way and react to other objects in the environment. However, it seems as if they've only put in 1 or 2 generic animations for pushing things away, so Lara is often just waving her hands at nothing. It does seem that they really wanted to use all of these animations though, as they mostly play out in their entirety. Now this becomes an issue when you're quickly moving between the animations. There's a distinct contrast between the realistic movement and the character who is switching frantically from jumping to cartwheeling to whipping out guns. Jumping between ledges looks goofy also. It's like they have an animation of making her jump, but sometimes the jump itself will take longer than the animation, leaving Lara with stiff, straight legs flying through the air like she's the gentleman from Buffy. The way a real human moves is a lot quicker and less readable than how a character would usually move in a methodically paced game such as this one, so the realism can take away from the player's ability to comprehend what Lara is doing. Speaking of that, sometimes when Lara is ledge climbing, her animations to show you where she would be jumping to just don't happen no matter what direction you press. Lara often wouldn't jump in the direction I thought that she was going to, and more than often it led me to an untimely death. On the topic of uncertainty caused by realism, the clearly defined ledges and interactable objects from Legend are all gone here, lost in the busy, shiny graphics. The environment is dressing up in its brand new realism clothes, and as such, it's much easier to lose track of the path forward in the big, open, naturalistic areas. Even worse, there's a lot of what look like handholds or ledges that exist by nature of making these levels look natural that you can't actually grab at all. Paired with the fact that Lara isn't nearly as sticky as she was in Legend when it comes to climbing points, and you get a game where you can just be running around lost, jumping against walls and off cliffs to your death. It's not fun. You'll notice that many of these problems cause senseless death, which is really something you don't want to be doing considering the loading times in these games. Granted, the amount of quick saves is pretty generous, they usually drop you not too far back from where you had managed to reach beforehand, but the loading times can be pretty bad. I played on PC so it wasn't much of an issue, but playing these games on console like I did originally, dying pointlessly this often with loading times this long, it must have driven my younger self mad. Legend didn't have the best loading times either, but at least then when you died it wasn't usually because of something out of your control. Even then you got these cool bits of artwork that fit the mood of each level. In Underworld you just get these dry voids. It's like they were trying to get this game to be frustrating and boring. Want to hear about something else that's frustrating? I don't know what happened to the camera in Tomb Raider Underworld, but it transcends irritating. It's obscenely zoomed in to the point where sometimes it fails to give an accurate view of anything at all, and it gets stuck on the smallest of things. It's seemingly far more interested in staring at Lara's torso than it is at actually showing me where it is I'm supposed to be going, or what I'm even doing. You can't travel through any kind of tight space without the camera having a panic attack and looking at anything other than the character it's supposed to be focusing on. It's like me at social functions. I've got many examples of where I was just trying to make my way through the environment and the camera was way more interested in showing me these lovely wall textures that it had found. I had a terrible turn of events where I glitched off a ledge, so I was holding these handholds in the wrong direction, unable to move Lara with the camera slowly moving towards her in a way I couldn't influence. Lara's increasing expression of discomfort mirroring my own. Because that's another thing! The camera swings around on its own, presumably trying to find a more cinematic angle, thank you realism, that usually doesn't show you where you need to be going. Then, when you try to move it, it will just swing back to where it was trying to go to because it doesn't trust you. When you pair this camera with the lack of conveyance in Lara's animations and the general busyness of the environments, it becomes a miserable experience to sit through at times. It's like the experience of trying to find a light switch on the other side of an unfamiliar room in pitch blackness, and it honestly makes the game seem a little unfinished. I'm not going to pretend in any way that Legend has a masterful camera or anything, it certainly does have its moments of frustration, but it feels at least like I'm always able to see what I need to in Legend. I know, low bar, but stay with me. The camera is a bit more zoomed out for one thing. You get a far better look at the level ahead of you. Also, the levels don't really feature any sections that the camera the developers had designed would struggle with, even when moving through tight areas such as this wall opening in Peru or the vents in Kazakhstan. There are one or two examples I could find of it getting a bit wiggy, like these mostly optional vents in the England level, but even then they usually snap back to a decent position so the player is only disoriented for a moment. It does occasionally dip or rise for a more cinematic angle in some scenarios, but even then the angle is usually useful and you can still move it when you'd like to. Like I say, the maps and levels seem a lot more considered when it comes to how the camera would be moving about. Lots of space for it to maneuver and get a good look at the action. It's functional, it works. C'est gut. I only bring it up to highlight how seemingly Underworld is struggling to clear even this low bar. When not exploring, the other half of the gameplay is making use of Lara's iconic dual pistols. Combat then. Both games kind of do the same thing, but in different ways. The developers seemingly wanted to emulate the bang bang pachow style of the Angelina Jolie Tomb Raider movies. It makes sense, they were probably the most well-known pieces of Tomb Raider culture at the time. It's a cool style that really fits the world-hopping action vibe of Legend. It's pretty simple to learn. You start by locking onto an enemy and firing away, using your Dark Souls dodge roll when you see them revving up to fire back. You can use grenades as well, and they are overpowered as fuck. Already, it feels pretty cool to play, but then wait. When you jump whilst holding your pistols, you do these cool strafe jumps, and you can still fire whilst doing them. If you run at an enemy and dodge towards them, you'll slide underneath them and you can juggle them in the air. And I'm not done. You can jump towards enemies to kick off them, and go full on Matrix bullet time to shoot at them and their friends. There's some enemies who are invulnerable to your different techniques, so it's not completely mindless, and there's multiple different weapons that all feel great to use. All of Lara's moves are animated to be so snappy, like whacha! Every combat encounter turns into a whoosh pow pow, exciting event. You hand it over to Underworld, and surprise surprise, it's a lot slower. There are some new moves. You can now shoot at 2 different enemies with the iconic pistols, which is nice, but doesn't really add all too much, particularly as the enemies are very bullet spongy. In fact, it feels like it takes a long time to kill enemies with any of the weapons the game gives you, except for the grenades. It feels like the developers knew this as well, because they let you carry fuck tons of them. I wound up dealing with enemies using grenades more than guns. All this iconography about the 2 pistols really needs to change to reflect this. Shout out to the rather bewildering way weapon selection works also. At the start of every level, once you've chosen the state of undress you'd like Lara to be in, it offers you a choice of weapon to take into the level. However, when you're in the level, you can just press select and choose any weapon you like at any time. It's a little bizarre. Back on track. It also feels like it's impossible to dodge attacks, as Lara's new realistic animations don't let her travel far enough to get out of the way of, say, a panther swipe or a stray shotgun blast. You can also now fire your weapons from ledges or posts. This was done as part of that "What would Lara do" initiative I mentioned earlier. It really just gives the game an excuse to throw some non-threatening bats or spiders at you. Shooting at the tiny enemies on these ledges looks really silly. I say they throw bats at you, but honestly I'm not even sure that they are bats, because upon holding the button down, Lara shoots them immediately with the accuracy and precision of a Terminator. You massacre groups of bats and it's just like, well okay, what was that for? They took out the slide kick, I guess because it looked a little silly, and we're a grown-up serious realistic game now, haven't you heard? They also replaced the bullet time with a slower, duller, less powerful version of bullet time, where you have to slowly move a circle in line with another circle before Lara hits the ground. It feels more like you're pressing a button and getting a cheap and easy kill, as opposed to going all equilibrium gun fu and letting off a hail of bullets into your enemies. Speaking of those enemies, the variation in enemy types is actually a little better in Underworld. Legend basically just has leopards and dudes, with far more of the latter than the former. Even 2 of its boss fights are just variations of dudes. Underworld doesn't have any bosses, but it does have some different enemies at least. There's these colour-coded lizards, sharks, zombie thralls, and giant spiders. They're odd choices considering the realism being pushed by the rest of the story, and the presence of some of them is really questionable. The giant spiders first show up in a secret temple in southern Thailand, which I can suspend my disbelief for. but then they're also in the level set underneath Croft Manor? Lara is very unperturbed by this. Like, I don't know about you, but I feel if I found out there was a hive of dog-sized spiders living underneath my house, I probably wouldn't mind it getting blown up. Point being is, for most of the combat you've got these Goosebumps tier monsters taking unavoidable lunges at you while you move and animate realistically, tossing overpowered grenades and shooting your tiny pea shooters. None of these elements really coalesce, and what you're left with is a really confusing experience, with a lot of frustrating death, and no sense of feeling like an accomplished fighter. What's next on that? Ooh, the bikes! Can't have your cool as ice 2000s character in a game without them doing some gnarly motorbike stunts. And oh boy, does Tomb Raider Legend live up to this requirement. Damn! Legend has 2 motorbike sections that both take the form of chase sequences. One where you're chasing after a convoy of lorries, and another chasing a train. Granted, you don't do an awful lot during them. Mostly you just avoid other vehicles while firing away at them and travelling through a looping area, but the surrounding context is what manages to make them exciting. You've got gun combat and the occasional stunt, and it controls quite nicely. Both of them have some banging tunes, and there's an excellent sense of forward momentum. Underworld takes a different approach, ditching the dedicated motorbike sections and just giving you the motorbike in some of the otherwise ordinary levels. You can't really do much on the bike other than travel to the next part where you need to get off, and there's not much to engage you whilst you're doing so. Occasionally the game will throw an enemy or two at you, but we've already established that killing enemies with guns takes so long, it's always just easier to drive past. It's not like you're penalised for doing so. Obviously Legend's bike was just getting you from one place to the other as well, but as we've established, Legend had things to do, whereas Underworld just has time wasting. The bike doesn't even control all that great. It feels really sloppy, so lining up the few jumps the game asks you to do always feels like a crapshoot, and it never reacts the way I want it to when interacting with any kind of sloped ground. You could have removed the motorbike and just moved all the level elements closer together, and you would lose nothing. If anything, it just makes the levels worse. You'd think that plonking the bike into the ordinary levels would signal that the developers wanted to incorporate it into some of the puzzles, but that happens maybe once in the whole game if I'm being generous. Otherwise, it's literally just used for a commute. I've been mentioning collectibles here and there throughout the video, but in Underworld, they kind of feel like a bit of an afterthought. I guess someone in the development team must have noticed they had made all these environments way too spacious for what is actually contained within them, and so they decided to include some collectibles to balance things out. Sometimes they'll just be slightly off the beaten path and are nothing more than a 10-second detour, whereas other times they're just in these little clusters of pots that you have to break open and, wow, there it is. I would argue that you can't even consider these bonuses for exploring the levels, as most of the time they're literally on the main path. Contrast this with Legend, and every level has a whole bunch of tiered rewards. There's the bronze, which tend to be just those 10-second detour style of collectible, but then there's a couple of silver ones that require you to perhaps go off the beaten path and do some extra platforming. That, and every level also has one gold relic, all of which require you to really study the environment, thinking outside the box whilst considering every element of the level. Almost like you're exploring, I don't know. I'll never forget the Peru gold relic where I shimmied around on this vine and noticed a secret area up here where I found another weight that I could use in a puzzle I'd previously completed below. It's so cool! That, and all the levels have unique designs for the collectibles themed around the culture of the country they're set in. It makes it kind of exciting to arrive in a new level and see what kind of shiny objects were hiding away in its nooks and crannies. Tell me what is at all endearing about these D8 dice that Lara can collect in Underworld. It just had me thinking that Lara must be planning a comically oversized D&D game once she's finished smashing up ancient artifacts of a culture that isn't her. The rewards that you get for the collectibles aren't nearly as exciting as in Legend either. You have to get all the relics just to unlock some concept art, and that's it. I don't want to go combing over these empty, bland areas just to get some admittedly nice artwork that I could just Google. Trust me when I say you'll find plenty of pictures of Lara Croft on the internet. Do you know what does incentivize me to grab relics? Upgrades to your character, or at least more than one unique costume. Underworld gives you one additional costume, and it's just a swimsuit for Lara. Boring! In Legend, you can dress up. Not just colour swaps either. Wear a styling suit, dress like you're going for a run. Serve up some My Chemical Romance energy, goth Lara! You can even dress as Amanda, the game's villain. Underworld just managed some colour swaps in paid DLC packs. They took out stuff we already had and sold it back to us. Having engaging collectibles and novel rewards for finding them gives Legend a far higher level of replayability that Underworld simply lacks. I mentioned DLC there, so we should probably talk about it. Underworld has some pretty scummy DLC practices. We're not going to spend too long on them because I didn't look at them, and out of principle I don't want to. This game has a bunch of DLC content that you can only get in the Xbox 360 version of the game. Console exclusive DLC. I have the 360 version, but I'm not going to try and use the Xbox store again after all these years. The main issue is just how much content was carved out of the game. Basically any bonus costumes are all DLC. Unfortunately, most of the costumes are just bikinis, because of course they are. But bonus costumes are important, they're good incentives to play through levels again, and it sucks that they've been carved out like this. And speaking of levels, actual levels! They basically hacked off the ending and epilogue to their game and sold it back to us. 2 additional levels that would have bumped the game's mission total up to the same amount as Legend. Even a level where you get to play as evil clone Lara, a whole new different character. The game feels unfinished because it literally is, and will remain as such on any console other than the Xbox 360. Tomb Raider Underworld was released on 5 different non-handheld platforms. That's 80% of your players who just aren't going to see the ending. It's pretty poor form. You have to consider how this will hold up in the future as well. One day Microsoft may decide it's too much money to keep the 360 content online, and then they'll take it down. In that scenario, the content will just be lost to time. The full ending and epilogue to a full-blown game just lost forever. I got my copy of Tomb Raider Legend years after it came out, and yet I can always have just as much fun with it today as I would have had back in 2006. If someone were to get Underworld today, chances are what they'd be buying would be incomplete and lacking. And that's it really, isn't it? The whole thesis. Underworld is simply lacking in everything that Legend excelled at. It pains me to say it, honestly. Wherever Legend feels considered and well structured, Underworld feels messy and poorly thought out. Wherever Legend feels like it has a clear vision and goal, Underworld feels like it's just iterating with no grasp on what was so great beforehand. Wherever Legend had me feeling invested and part of its world, Underworld has me checked out and really not caring. And it is a real shame. With the foundation it had, Underworld could have been truly incredible. But why even bring this up, Alex, you may ask? For what reason have you decided to spend the last hour of your life talking about these 2-decade-old games? What is this about? Closure? To which I would argue, isn't that what it's all about? Why we dig up the past? To understand it? Earlier this year, I played Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the latest game in the series, and I can't say I enjoyed it all too much. It felt like it was unfocused, lacking in any kind of character depth, and quite unpolished. The Tomb Raider fandom seems to agree with me on the whole, and sales are down to the weakest they've been since the 2013 reboot. These sales, along with the publisher's comments about the game not being novel enough, I honestly feel like we may be at another Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness turning point in the series, looking to invigorate it with a new direction, and I'd like to think we can learn a lot by looking back to the last time this happened. Maybe for the next game we can go back to the lovable characters, the rock-solid structure, the sense of wonder and exploration, and the engaging story. I make this video because I'd like to communicate the idea that we can look back to the past, find the parts of it that work, piece them together and develop it to make something really magical. Much like Lara at the end of Legend, we may have failed once, but we can still look forward, learn our lessons, and move into the future with a new drive to create something that we can all love and enjoy. Isn't that what Lara would do? It's 4:15 in the morning.